Welcome to The Breach Show. I'm Martin Lukacs, filling in for the next few episodes for Donya Ziai, who is starting a maternity leave soon. Our technician is also off on vacation, so I'm not in studio, but in my homie office. And Elle Jones is joining us from Winnipeg, and Pam Palmater in Toronto. How you two?
Hey. Hi.
So this week, we're covering two subjects. U.S. Supreme Court decision on abortion is still resonating across the continent, and I'll be talking with reproductive justice activist Darrah Teitel about abortion access in Canada. And just 1 year after Canada Day was cancelled in some cities, lots of people seem excited to attach flags to children again. Has nationalism taken a hit, or do people still get the warm and fuzzies when they think of Canada? We'll discuss. Okay, let's turn to my interview with Darrah. Last week saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It had enshrined legal access to abortion in 1973 in the US, and its repeal will lead to almost total bans on abortion in about half of the US states. Though the decision was leaked a few weeks ago, somehow it was still no less shocking when officially announced last Friday. Other than some celebrations from right-wing politicians, the reaction in Canada has been mostly an outpouring of grief and expressions of solidarity. And, it has to be said, a bit of Canadian self-satisfaction. Today, to talk about the situation in Canada, we're joined by longtime reproductive justice activist Darrah Teitel. Darrah is a former organizer with Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, and currently a labor organizer with the Amalgamated Transit Union. Darrah, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, do Canadians have any reason to be satisfied with the current state of abortion access in Canada?
I mean, I think we have some reasons to feel proud of certain parts of our movement and the actions that have brought us here. The women who were instrumental in creating the Morgentaler decision, as well as Henry Morgentaler himself, and how strong and robust that Supreme Court decision was compared to Roe v. Wade. And I think that's important to remember. However, I do think, and I also think we have to be proud of the fact that 60 to 70% of Canadians are routinely polled to say that they are in favor of women having unfettered access to abortion. So, those populist numbers are proving a good story here. Nevertheless, I think that we have to say for the millionth time that the trouble in Canada is not that we don't have the right to access to abortion, it's that we cannot access abortion. So few people outside of some of the largest urban centers in Canada can easily access an abortion, even though it is considered an essential health service. And we have fully pro-choice prime minister, and we have no legislative barriers to accessing abortion. So outside of, maybe 2 or 3 of the big cities in Canada, abortion access is few and far between. Often in rural areas, you have one abortion clinic or one provider inside of a hospital, and they are working around the clock to try and provide the abortions that are necessary. And in many, many, many places, you have to travel thousands and thousands of kilometers to find an abortion. So it becomes an issue, like so many other things, of resources, time, money, and the ability to advocate for yourself or to find people who can advocate for you in order to get what is an essential health service, and a really simple one at that, especially with the introduction of medical abortion, which was legalized in Canada woefully late in 2017, some 30 years after it had been used safely and legally in countries around the world. We finally had it approved in Canada from Health Canada after a fight with a very long-standing anti-choice Health Canada board approval process. And we got that. And then the pill came down and it was $400. So it is the simplest way for people to be prescribing abortions, because anyone can prescribe it, or a registered nurse, a nurse practitioner, any family physician. It's just a medication. You can get it from any local pharmacy if the pharmacy is ordering it. And then what we found was this huge cost barrier. So it kind of became part of that larger Canadian narrative that, sure, abortions aren't, being blocked except by your life circumstances. your ability to pay for them, your ability to travel for them, your ability to know where they are, your ability to access the advocacy that you need in order to get your appointment and keep it. And so many people are denied that choice.
With everything being as you say, what do you make of this emerging discourse that we've seen about people starting up underground railroads from the U.S. to our land of supposedly abundant abortions?
Yeah, honestly, it makes me a little pukey. Just the smugness and the self-satisfaction that we are once again exhibiting towards our comrades in the States. And, it comes from a noble place of wanting to help, but it shows a total lack of understanding, firstly, of the health system and how much money and time and resources is necessary in order to take somebody from a location where they can't get an abortion and get them an appointment someplace across a border, even, let alone in another state or province. This is something that we worked with firsthand at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. We ran the Norma Scarborough Fund and a 24-hour access line where we would have to book abortions for people in Canada who often could not find abortions anywhere close to where they lived. And it would cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And it would often be with people who were really desperate and who would stumble upon our resource to be able to find it. But like hundreds and thousands of women cannot find those resources on a regular basis, right? Like it only stands to reason. It's a very niche service that we provide. And so, knowing intimately what the details are of abortion tourism, as it's called, I know how difficult and strategically damn near impossible it would be for us to run that kind of underground railroad up to Canada. And then you have the problem of the fact that we don't have any resources to deliver these services to Canadian women. So why are we expecting that Health Canada and the services in Health Canada, despite what Minister Karina Gold said, which was like, you're all welcome here. And I was like, oh, really? Who's paying for this? You can't even muster up a few $100,000 to pay for services in most clinics inside of Canada. So who's paying for it? How are you getting through the migration process difficulties? How is anybody without a passport supposed to get a passport? And then who's going to pay for the travel, the childcare, the lost wages for these people who can't find abortion? So no, this is not a solution. It's sweet, but it's not a solution. And I think it's smug for Canadians to be suggesting that to Americans.
And I understand that when you were working at Action Canada, the abortion tourism would extend often to sending Canadians to the States, in fact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had a lot of interprovincial travel for sure, because there are whole provinces in Canada where it's almost impossible to get an abortion. The Maritimes is a nightmare, like the entire east coast of Canada. It's really hard to get any kind of abortion services. But then after you get to a certain term limit, like after a few weeks of being pregnant, then we were forced to send people down to the States because in a very practical sense, there are a lot more providers willing to do abortions in later terms in America than there are in Canada.
I actually have a graphic. Let's throw that on the screen. It actually shows provincial term limits for abortion in Canada. So
that's bad.
In weeks of pregnancy when you can no longer actually get an abortion. Do you want to help break down the meaning of this graph for us?
Well, I mean, it just shows that we don't have people who are willing, either for legal terms or because of the hospital regulations, or just because they can't get a provider who knows how to do these procedures in most places in Canada that go over 20 weeks. So you're sending people all the time to Quebec and BC that have a provider that will do it. And I'm talking one. It's not like it's available all over the province or easily across the province. And then there are places like whole swaths of territory, like the North, where there's nothing. And in provinces like New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and PEI, it's incredibly low term limits. Like we're talking 10, 12, 15 weeks, thereabouts, right? And these are provinces that are also incredibly under-resourced when it comes to having providers who can provide abortion. And I'll go back to abortion medication because that is a solution for access in a huge way. Pills can be delivered through nurses and any doctor across the country in rural and remote places where people wouldn't have access to others. But we do have very few providers who feel willing to take on that role as a provider or who offer that as an option. And there's a lack of education in general. So that's something the federal government can help with and also isn't, which is to, take on a big information campaign. That would be extremely helpful.
You mentioned that, Justin Trudeau and other Liberal ministers have said, comforting things about Canadians' access to abortion. Can you tell us what their actual record on it is?
So I will say that, there was a blacklisting of abortion providers and advocacy under Harper, and that was really bad. And that extended to our global work across the world. And through Trudeau's term, he has slowly, and with a lot of reminding, gotten rid of those kinds of blacklisting actions. And now abortion access and advocacy organizations are receiving some funding. But, we have a short list of things that they could do right now to improve access to abortion. And unless there's like a camera in their face or something, horrific and dystopian going on in the States, they won't act as fast or as effectively as is entirely within their capability of doing.
I want to ask you about a specific situation. We have a clip we're going to play from last summer when the Liberals made an announcement in New Brunswick where, provincial Conservative government has stopped funding an abortion clinic 554 in Fredericton. Let's play this clip.
Access to surgical abortions is a flashpoint in New Brunswick. The province is the only one that doesn't fund out-of-hospital surgical abortions, which are only available at hospitals in Moncton and Bathurst. But 2 years ago, the Prime Minister promised that would change. Then just 11 days ago, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland reaffirmed that promise.
We all have the right to access to those services. Our government is absolutely clear on that, and we are very clear about a woman's right to choose.
So, the usual Liberal, song and dance seems positive. What's going on in New Brunswick, and what has been the Liberal government's response?
Okay, so let's start with the fact that for over 30 years, the province of New Brunswick has been standing in flagrant opposition, disavowal of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision when it comes to Morgentaler. For many, many years, they still had therapeutic abortion committees there where you would need a doctor's signature in order to prove that the life or health of a woman is at risk in order to get an abortion. And more than that, and this is the thing that is consistent till today, they have what is known as Regulation now I'm forgetting. Regulation 8420. That's it. Regulation 8420, which is a simple regulation inside of their Health Act, which says that they will not be funding abortions, covering the cost of abortions, the way that we are all entitled to public health care in this country, outside of hospitals. And so that means that the Morgentaler Clinic there that has existed for many years was operating out of necessity as a private clinic and went under, some 8 to 10 years ago. And then it was rescued by a group of feminist activists who crowdfunded in order to keep it alive. It became Clinic 554. Some extremely dedicated healthcare professionals, took it over, came from BC, made it their life's work to move to New Brunswick and make that clinic operate. And they started providing trans healthcare and other sexual rights and healthcare there, which was really awesome. But it is an unsustainable financial endeavor. And so this was laid at the doorstep of the federal government over the course of successive minority and majority governments of late, and still nothing was done for many, many, many years. And then finally, as if, the thought had sprung out of their forehead like Zeus, they're like, oh, why don't we use the Canada Health Act in order to, well, they didn't say that. We said, use the Canada Health Act, use the stick part of this, deny them funding from the Canada Health transfers unless they come in line with our legislation. And they did. And they denied them $100,000 or something along that line, right? And I think they did this once, twice. Anyhow, it's a completely negligible amount of money. It did absolutely nothing to move the needle. And abortion remains completely inaccessible, while the clinic, I think, is just like by the skin of their teeth hanging in there through charitable donations.
more broadly, what does this and generally how the Liberal government interacts with feminist organizations tell us about, what their
It gets them
abiding
the
agenda is?
it gets them the 30-second TV spot. It gets them the ability to stand in front of the clinic wearing a giant L, and in doing so, it makes things seem like they are okay or they're going to be okay, while things remain totally, totally not okay. And it has this dangerous demobilizing effect on the people who are, credibly concerned about what's going on. I don't think you have to be cynical to sort of see what's going on there, right? Like, the Prime Minister knows that 70% of people would want action on this if they understood the story. And when activists bring it to the point where the public does understand the story, the fact that you can't get an abortion in PEI is like on everybody's lips. The fact that everybody who calls themselves a feminist now knows what Clinic 554 is. They realize they have to say something, and they can exploit that lefty energy, and then they co-opt it. And in doing so, the irony, like, as if the co-optation isn't bad enough, and like taking the work and the words of activists is not bad enough, they also don't do anything about it. So it's this whole bait and switch, and it's really dangerous. And it's the liberal climate that we live under here in Canada.
Let me ask you about the anti-choice movement, which is undoubtedly feeling empowered now after the Roe v. Wade decision. What are their targets, and what should we be on the watch for?
I don't think Morgentaler is actually a target of theirs right now. And there are several reasons that I can get into for that. I think it would be a much harder piece of Supreme Court ruling, of legal ruling to break. And that's with due credit to Morgentaler himself, who worked really hard to keep that case about abortion and about what abortion, without having abortion, how that harms women and how that harms our human rights and how that causes us to die. And so, without, tearing up the charter, it would be really hard to break the Morgentaler decision, unlike Roe v. Wade, which is mostly about privacy and doctors' agency. However, they've been in Canada working really strong, funded by the same massive megachurch corporations and funds that they are funded by in the States. And now they have more anti-choice pregnancy crisis center clinics than we have abortion clinics, by a lot. In some places in Alberta, like freaking Calgary, they have like 7-1, right? Wow. So their presence is here. It's here to stay. They are vicious. They enjoy charitable status from our federal government, which is one of the things that we lobby for them to revoke, and is something easy that they could do in order to break these organizations. Like, let's not forget that their sole method of operation is to mislead, provide wrong, inaccurate health information to people, to harass, to guilt, and to delay. And abortion, as we know, is a time-sensitive procedure, and delaying people can lead to harm and death. So why an organization whose entire job it is to lie and abuse, harass and mislead, and eventually physically harm people is given charitable status in this country is really something that Trudeau should be reckoning with. And that's, if I were a journalist, the question that I would put in his face right now.
As a last question, can I ask you, what do you think that movements for reproductive justice should look like today, especially in light of Roe v. Wade, and what is next?
Yeah, I think, we've been talking a lot about sort of the institutions and the politicians and the courts. And I think we need, as activists, to reorient ourselves down to grassroots organizing, just like our mothers did in the 60s and 70s, and just like women have been doing for generations. Because, look at the states, right? Like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg gets really, really old and chooses not to retire from the Supreme Court. One liberal, progressive woman doesn't retire fast enough, and the entire, the rights of hundreds of thousands of people are now flushed down the toilet a few years later. We cannot resist relying on these hero type figures and lauding them, but we also really need to mistrust them with our lives and our health and our benefits. So I'm calling on every single person out here to start considering the ways in which we can take reproductive justice, reproductive health back into our own hands. These pills, these medications, they are easy to get. They're easy to self-administer if you know how to do it. And we need to be starting movements that rely on ourselves. And I know that organizing is harder because you can't just sort of sit back and comment on the people who you've invested with power. But it's also super empowering because there is something that we can all be doing right now. And there are movements out there. And I really feel and I hope and I pray that what's going on in the States will help Canadians lose a little bit more faith in our top-down institutions and bring young women and young feminists and young allies and young queer folks back into a sphere where we're organizing for ourselves and taking things into ourselves and not trusting people to do it for us.
Well, on that note, Darrah, thank you so much for talking with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's bring in the panel. Pam and Elle, I mentioned some right-wingers were celebrating about the decision. Some, like MP Arnold Viersen, weren't so much celebrating as posting weird videos from airport parking lots. Let's take a quick look.
300 babies die every day in Canada, and this is something that is a terrible human rights tragedy in Canada. It's the greatest human rights violation of our time, and it's something that motivates me to be engaged in politics, and I hope that it engages you as well. So the 300 babies that die every day in Canada, the hope is on hope springs eternal.
Pam, his selective concern over hundreds of dead children seems a bit jarring and terribly ironic, considering Canada Day a few days from now. What's your take on all this?
Exactly. There's thousands and thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women and little girls. There are many Indigenous children that don't survive birth or don't survive babyhood because of all of the socioeconomic conditions of poverty, but primarily because of racial discrimination and a lack of human rights for them. First Nations children and babies have the highest poverty rate in all of the country. In provinces like Manitoba, that rate's like 75%. So his fake concern for, unborn fetuses that were terminated, through an abortion is just that. It's opportunistic, it's manipulative, it's for political purposes, because you notice how he tied it to that's why I wanted to get into politics. So this is all about him, has nothing to do with babies, or he would be advocating against poverty and supports for women.
And what's your sense of more broadly how the right wing and the anti-abortion movement is reacting to this decision in the States?
Well, this is fuel for them. Think about it. So they had, throughout the years, they were always trying to use things like freedom, free speech, that kind of stuff. And then the pandemic came along. So it's like, great. What a great way to recruit people who don't want to be inconvenienced by pandemic measures. And that helped recruit people. And now that the pandemic measures in many parts aren't even there anymore, they needed something else to keep the momentum going. And now they have Roe versus Wade, this abortion issue. So at every stage, the far right is going to use these social issues to recruit and try to retain their power.
And Elle, I'm curious, having listened to the interview with Darrah Teitel, what's your sense, too, of the implications in Canada from the Roe v. Wade decision?
Well, first of all, I think we need a Supreme Court ruling to ban people from filming in vertical. Beyond that, I think what was interesting from the interview was I think she really captured the way that liberalism works. So when she talked about people being outside this clinic wearing a big L, which isn't that the Liberals, they're always wearing a big L in this country. But this idea that it's always a superficial engagement. And part of liberalism, as she said, is exactly supposed to keep us complacent enough that we cease to organize. So it's always meant as a gatekeeping and stop to social movements, give us just enough. So I think that really shows us in Canada. Liberals aren't interested in expanding women's rights, expanding rights for gender care, any of that stuff that people actually need. But you can go pose outside a clinic that you're not going to fund and that is hanging on by a shoestring. And then that's more progressive than what you can expect from the other party. I think it also leads into, I think what's interesting is I'm not sure that people really ever thought that Roe versus Wade would really be repealed. And it's one of those useful things where both sides could use it. So the Democrats could say, you need to vote Democrat, even though we're not giving you anything in terms of social policies, because otherwise Roe versus Wade would be repealed. And conservatives could use it to say, white Christian evangelicals are so oppressed in this country. Look at how babies are being murdered. But I don't know that conservatives actually want to live in the liberal democracy that they pretend to hate, right? They want to use all the rights that other people fought for. They want to live in a cosmopolitan place. They want access to everything. If they really wanted to live in a theocracy, they would move to one, right? And realistically, I don't think even the conservatives really, really, really want to experience what they're going to experience if all of those rights are dialed back. And I think we see a similar thing in Canada where there's a lot of rhetoric that people like to use. But when it actually comes down to it, as Pam said, there's not really a political will by the Liberals or our so-called left to actually do the work on an organized way to expand these rights. But it's useful to sort of say, look at the states, they could do that here, vote Liberal.
Okay, let's shift gears now. This Friday, July 1st, is Canada's birthday. And last year, as unmarked graves were being discovered or confirmed on the grounds of former residential schools, the media talked about a year of reckoning. Justin Trudeau declared that July 1st was, for some, not yet a day of celebration. Flags were lowered to half-mast, and in a few cities, Canada Day was even cancelled. 1 year on, our political class has clearly got tired of all that reckoning. Canada Day is back. But to varying degrees, it's definitely not just about hot dogs, face painting, and bad beer anymore. Let's take our listeners through some of the headlines that we're seeing. So from the West Coast, we've got Victoria, who canceled Canada Day last year, but celebrations are on again this year with a twist. The article says that instead of the national anthem playing through the fireworks this year, Lekwungen music will be worked into the presentation. In Calgary, the Calgary Herald seems to have found a photo of children with like the highest possible concentration of Canadian flags per square centimeter. And even Calgary, though, will at least be shifting, and there'll be an Indigenous showcase and a powwow apparently. Let's look at Halifax. In Halifax, the city's partnering with the Native Friendship Center, and the promo clearly has a different vibe. And then lastly, the city of Winnipeg, where LUR this week is probably undergoing the biggest change, with Canada Day being renamed New Day. No fireworks. Let's watch this short news clip that sums up what's different this year.
It's not Canada Day, but a new day. The Forks is turning the page on traditional July 1st celebrations by launching a new event to celebrate the country's birthday. The annual fireworks show on Canada Day at the Forks will be no longer, as celebrations will look a little different this year. Instead, the day will focus on celebrating Indigenous culture, including music and dance. Visitors will also be able to take part in other multicultural experiences throughout the day that reflects the diversity of Canada. Residential school survivor Belinda Vandenbroek says this decision is a long time coming.
So, Pam, what do you think has shifted? Has anything shifted in the last year or so? I'm curious to get your sense.
I don't see a significant shift. I mean, it doesn't matter what name you put on it. If you're celebrating and it's on Canada Day, it's a Canada Day celebration. And it really goes to signify how quick issues leave the media, how short the memories are of politicians, of leaders, of municipalities who literally canceled everything last time. Now, I'm not saying that was all a good, they were doing that out of the goodness of their heart. We were still in the pandemic. Many of them didn't want gathering, so there's all that. But, there are still the search for thousands of other unmarked graves. Nothing has been done about the genocide, the ongoing murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We're not addressing any of the issues that we considered a national crisis, such that we can say, okay, we're good now. Let's go back to celebrations. And that's effectively what they are, no matter what they call it or how they portray it. They're still celebrations. And so I don't see anything different. I don't see what's been reckoned, that's for sure. I think it's just a matter of a lot of, political rhetoric, as you can expect from politicians, to be able to justify moving forward pretty much as is, with only the tinkering around the edges. And that's pretty much the theme for reconciliation. Nobody wants the radical shift and changes that are needed, but lots of tinkering around the edges, name changes, street name changes, that kind of thing, but not really the substantive.
I wanted to take us through some polls that indicate, I think, some of the shifts among ordinary Canadians, because I think that is a heartening and positive thing that seems to have shifted in the last few years, thanks in large part to movements surging. Let's throw up the poll from Ipsos, and feel free anytime to jump in with your thoughts. So there was this poll from Ipsos in 2021 that, not showing a radical shift, but showing that, in 2019, 49% of Canadians thought racism is a serious problem. Now, in 2021, 60%. Then there was a much more detailed poll from Innovative Research that I found pretty interesting. Looking at just this one question for podcast listeners, the question was, Indigenous peoples were here first. They deserve compensation for the injustices they suffered when they lost their lands. We might quibble with the question itself, but I was struck that since 2007, a gap of 15 years, there's been pretty significant growth in people strongly agreeing that there are serious reparations to be paid, and also interestingly a kind of diminishment in people who strongly disagreed with that. Pam, to your point, it was striking to me that there was, since, as you said, the media kind of lost interest, the politicians did their song and dance, there has been a dip in that support, which is interesting. But the pollster who did this said that what's striking is that support is stable, like stably growing, and there might even be what he called a new normal in attitudes in terms of growing support. And then there was one last poll, from Léger, which I found striking. Most of them kind of run-of-the-mill questions, but then near the bottom, there's one question that really stood out to me. 57% of Canadians agreed with the following statement: the discovery of the mass graves in Kamloops and the potential for others like it makes me question the whole moral foundation that Canada has been based on. I'm like, hello there. That's like, reads like a question that was introduced by an anti-colonial trickster. And if you look at the breakdown by age, for those aged 18 to 35, agreement jumps to 70%. So 70% of young people are basically questioning the claim of moral goodness that, the nation state of Canada kind of relies on. I found that striking. Is that your sense too, that there is this kind of underlying shift happening, at least among attitudes?
Oh, yeah. So, there's been some shift in fairness in mainstream media. They cover these issues more. It stays a little bit longer. You'll see more Indigenous voices. Politicians, of course, have all absorbed that into their rhetoric. NDP and Liberals tend to have more Indigenous issues in their platform, not so much Conservatives. But my real hope has always been and remains in the people, in Canadians, because the vast majority of Canadians on a whole range of issues, whether it's human rights, environmental issues, anti-racism, Indigenous issues, are much more aware. They're much more educated, and they're much more likely to take substantive action than they were before. Like in history, the focus was on just being aware, but not really changing anything. Now Canadians realize they have the numbers, the power, the wealth, and the positions of influence to actually affect change, not just at the political level for voting, but in the institutions in which they work. And you see some significant movement, and that's all coming from the people. It's not coming from governments. And I think all of the change that's needed for all of us will probably continue to come from the people if we don't forget about the importance of organizing and education and standing in solidarity with one another.
Elle, what's your sense about how much of this soul searching is genuine, in part thanks to just the work of movements?
Well, I suppose I'm a cynic, because my first thought when you said that 70% of young people now believe that they're questioning the moral foundations of Canada is that we're rapidly going to see, as similar to the anti-CRT kind of push in the States, they're going to be like, the teachers are indoctrinating the young people with hatred of Canada. We need to ban the teaching of residential schools and Indigenous rights. Like, that's probably what will happen, if anything, that we're going to start saying that, children are being poisoned, and we'll have like the libs of TikTok thing happening.
I mean, that's definitely happening in Quebec for sure. Under the right-wing government, they've been like rolling back the changes in the textbooks. But yeah, sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm in Winnipeg right now, hence why I look like I'm giving a hostage video because I'm not in my normal environment. But the Winnipeg Free Press is just full of letters. And this is grown people. So I can't imagine at my age being upset about a fireworks show. Like I could go and buy some fireworks if I really need to. But this is very upsetting to actual grown adults. And, the pages of the Winnipeg Free Press letter section just full of people complaining about this, feeling oppressed by this, and in particular angry at a chief who said that people need to own up to their colonialism and the violence of Canada. And they're like, that's violent. Reconciliation doesn't mean accusing white people. And, it's just all of this nonsense about how something's being taken away from them. And this chief should apologize because he's being divisive. And this is not how you build a relationship by yelling at people. And so you very much are seeing this reluctance, not only at the level of the letter writers of the Free Press, but of course Lloyd Axworthy, who, let us not forget, at the University of Winnipeg was a big push on founding their human rights program, is talking about, this is too much. We need unity now more than ever. This very 90s style. You used to get this in the 90s about Quebec separatism, right? That we all needed to be all hands on board for Canada or something would happen. So this idea that now more than ever, we should be celebrating Canada Day and our unity. And he's made a number of comments that are being quoted by people to prove how extreme Indigenous people are being. So I don't know how much we're really seeing shifts. A lot of people are planning apparently on attending like real Canada Day events. And it's become this huge political football that is very effectively being wielded to give people this sense of grievance, to turn people against Indigenous people, to suggest that Indigenous people are the bullies and, white people are the real victims. And we see this all the time when BLM speaks. Whenever people begin to speak up about injustice, we, of course, become the ones that are oppressing everybody else. So it's quite wild, unsurprising, but very wild to see this kind of rhetoric and see how just unwilling people are, like as if you can't still crack out the barbecue, as if you're not still getting the day off work, as if anybody's preventing you from putting a Canada Day flag up or going to the store and buying fireworks, whatever you want to do. But no, it can't just be you. It has to be sanctioned by the state. And the other thing that they're, of course, saying is that somehow Indigenous people are making this political. So, let's pause. This is Canada Day, a national celebration of a nation where we play the national anthem and wave Canadian flags, but that's not political. But it would be political to hold a powwow or to talk about residential schools.
It's interesting that you bring up, this kind of backlash that's emerging, even to, very minor kind of symbolic renovations of Canada Day. And I'm curious too about the kind of far right reaction that we've seen. In Ottawa, people's eyes will be on that city this year, where the interim police chief is saying that there's going to be larger crowds in a larger event than ever, in part because it seems like convoy protesters are yet again going to try to converge on the city. I'm curious about trying to link the Canada Day celebrations to the convoy, because as much as they were animated by an anti-vax and vax mandate agenda, I also think it's not a coincidence that, just a few months after flags were, flown at half mast, a few months after Canada Days were canceled or symbolically tweaked, a cavalcade of right-wing protesters showed up in Ottawa, aggressively wielding flags as if they were some kind of proud trophy. So I do think there's a kind of raw nostalgia-fueled attempt to reassert, a view of Canada as kind of untainted by, the reality of Indigenous children in graves.
I think it's also perhaps deeper than that. I think what it's really showing. So if you think, I'm not saying they're a direct connection, but if you look at the footage from January 6th, of course, all those people are waving American flags. And what they're really signaling is we are the only real and true citizens of America. So when we go to overturn the Constitution and, literally try to depose this government, we have the right to that because every other voter is an illegitimate voter and we are the people that truly belong. And that's really what the use of these symbols is. So when they talk about freedom in Ottawa, while they're waving their Canadian flags, as white conservative right-wingers, the signal is actually, this is our country. We are the true voters. So if we want to remove Trudeau, it doesn't matter what the election said, because you guys don't count. You're all a bunch of immigrants and Indigenous people and illegitimate second-class citizens. And since we don't like this government, we should actually get to choose. So it's actually an assertion of white citizenship at the exclusion of everybody else. And that's why we're seeing these symbols being used. It's about who they believe has political power and who's illegitimate.
Pam, what's your sense of how the right is kind of organizing around Canada Day?
That's a really good question, Martin, because it looks like they're celebrating Canada, but I agree with everything that Elle said. What I think that they're really doing is not so much reacting, but using these scenarios as strategic opportunities to recruit, to put their messages out there, to make their hate normalized, to make it an option. And they're using all of these things. So before it was whether or not there was academic freedom to say racist and hateful things, and that was so an attack on them. Or then you have the pandemic, and wearing masks is an attack on their freedom. And so other Canadians who were not so happy with the inconvenience of it all then were able to join forces. And now you've got this other opportunity with Roe versus Wade and, you know, skyrocketing this conversation around abortion. And so, of course, they're anti-abortion. And they're really bringing this all together to strategically keep themselves in the media as of some kind of viable alternative. And it helps to recruit.
Okay, that'll have to be it for the show this week. If you're taking in some aspect of Canada Day festivities on Friday, make sure to do it with a responsible, anti-colonial attitude. Thanks to Pam and Elle as always, and thanks to you for listening. If you enjoy this, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps a lot. And if you like what we do, please consider becoming a member at breachmedia.ca to support our work. I'm Martin, signing off for The Breach Show.